Good morning, everyone. I'll call the Commission Policy Meeting to order. I will note that online, correct me if I'm wrong, we have Chairman Krajewski, we have Professor Rago, we have Senator Street, Representative Bonner, and Chairman Fox. There too. Okay. So we welcome all of those joining us online. Here in person, we have Judge McLaughlin, Judge Daly, Attorney Volkovic, and we have DOC Representative, I'm going to, Arowitz?
Yes, very good.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Klein.
Great. Thank you, Judge. Good morning, everyone. So at today's policy meeting, we have a couple of topics that we are going to cover. The first is just to review the Commission's budget. Since our last meeting, the Commission received our appropriation from the General Assembly and just walk through a little bit of the implications of the appropriation that we received. We'll follow that with a short overview of Senate Resolution 196, which is our project that we've been assigned by the Senate to look at veterans involved in the criminal justice system. We've formally kicked that project off, and then we have a guest speaker who will be joining us from the Veterans Administration to talk about the role that the VA plays in this process, the services they provide, but also the screening and assessment tools. And so you'll see the directives that we received from the Senate and how understanding really the resources in communities. One of the themes for that I'll get into is the variation, of course, by county of what's available at the county level, but the important role that the VA plays in bridging some of the gaps there. Following the guest speaker, we'll have an update on our CASER project, the SGS Web. As you know, we've been working with a vendor for the last year and a half, a couple different vendors to develop the web-based application to support the 8th edition guidelines. So Christy will talk about our new path forward on that. And then hopefully we'll have time to also talk about a new initiative. At the last meeting, we talked about two new initiatives, one being leveraging data to create these data stories or data snapshots. So we've created our first one that we're happy to share with you. And then again, the other initiative that we won't be talking about is the community engagement component, except for what happened at the National Association of Sentencing Commission meetings related to that topic with Representative Krajewski and Ryan's involvement. So with that, let me begin by working through and talking about our budget. So our operating budget that was approved at the last commission meeting was roughly $4 million. And for this illustration, I'm removing the money that was delegated or designated for this CASER project or the SGS Web reboot. So we'll think of that separately at the end, but without the CASER project, our operating expenses is roughly $3.4 million. So I want to dig into that a little bit about what makes up that $3.4 million. So of that, the staff salaries are $2.8 million, or roughly 80% of our total operating budget. And at the business meeting, we'll talk more about the staff salary component, asking for a modification of our operating budget. We work with Penn State, as you know, and their fringe rate increase. So there'll be an increase in our staff salaries to support the fringe rate. And we can talk about that more, but of course the fringe rate is our things like retirement and healthcare that we receive through the university. They negotiate that with vendors, and that rate changes yearly, sometimes up, sometimes down. I'm not sure what drives that. But needless to say, 82% of our operating budget is staff salaries. We also have, thinking about like fixed costs like these salaries, we have the money that we spend for the memorandum of understanding with Penn State University, and then also our payment for our legal counsel. So combined, that gets us to $3.1 million, or 90%. We also have this extra 10%, about $330,000, for other operating expenses. And this is things like hosting these commission meetings, having the court reporter, our computers, the software programs we have. A big issue, and you'll see later, is the travel we have related to education and training. So one way to think of it is, essentially this is a 10%, I don't use the word here fixed, but most of it is fixed, even though there are wiggle room for different things we can and cannot, we might choose not to do. So just as an example, we have some new modules related to e-learning, and we're utilizing that as a way in this phase 2 that Bobby Seasock, the manager, will talk about later, educating and training people about the new guidelines in a remote fashion. Well, the software platform for that is $750. That's a really nominal cost, but it is a discretionary cost that we could choose to eliminate. But as we started thinking about some of these decisions, I think the way I've been framing it in my head is, who will the impact be upon if we make small decisions to reduce expenditures? There'll, of course, be judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, probation officers, court staff, our key stakeholders in terms of our outreach and education. And then some of it also would be on staff themselves here at the commission, if we said no trainings for a year, whatever it may be. But one way to think about this, again, so I've laid out, that's the full operating budget without the CASER project, again, $3.4 million, made up primarily of staff, these fixed costs, and then this small amount of other operating expenses at the end. So as most of you know, we received, again, flat funding from the General Assembly. This is our, I believe, 7th year or 6th year of flat funding at this same rate of $2.553 million. So if we just took a look at just our salaries, we have $300,000 short for our salaries when thinking about our general fund appropriation. If we add on all these other operating costs, some of which are fixed, we're almost $1 million short of the operating budget, not counting, again, the monies for the CASER project or SGS Web rebuild. So what I wanted to highlight a little bit here was, as you saw, there were $300,000 in that far right orange box, which a lot of those are fixed. So there is no belt tightening that the commission can do to meet this shortfall. It's not like we're over budget by $12,000 and we can meet this overrun by adjusting our policies or practices. Partly because of just looking at our salaries alone, we can't even pay our payroll based on the current appropriation. So now I'm going to look at the other side of the equation. What monies does the commission have available currently to keep our operations going? So we have this shortfall, as I mentioned, of about $900,000. We have our appropriation. Last year, because of vacancies, for example, with the deputy director position we filled later, and other positions, we had a mini surplus of $90,000. We also have this reserve fund that you've heard us talk about at many meetings for a long time, and the purpose of those reserves were developed by the General Assembly in case there was a budgetary impasse. And the idea was, if there was a budgetary impasse, this would cover our expenses for roughly 3 months of time. So if we were to utilize and drain all those reserves and all of the carryover funds, we're still short $72,000 for this year. So we have another piece, which is our JRI-2 funds. And we were fortunate to receive another $400,000 this year for the JRI-2 funds. So certainly we can draw into those funds to pay this shortfall in the short run. However, that money's been, in my mind, and this is not an official term, but my term, been earmarked for the development of this CASER SGS Web project. As you know, we have external vendors we've been working with, consultants. So I'm trying to keep that sort of separate a little bit, and we'll have to, if this works the way it works, to drain a little bit about it. But I think the story from this is, if the same thing happens next year, we don't have $750,000 in reserves. Our JRI2 money will be less because we'll be paying consultants, so maybe, and we'll see, potentially there could be $300,000 left in the JRI2 funds. It still wouldn't even cover our salaries for the entire year, the following fiscal year. So I think we can keep the lights on in this fiscal year, but it has a pretty big impact, of course, on our reserves. And I personally, and would love to get the input of the commission on two fronts, which is, we've been maintaining the commitments that we've made. So as an example, Ryan spearheads working with Professor Chanison, this Villanova workshop. It's a pretty small line item in our budget of $25,000. This is just an example that this is a commitment that I would like to continue, and the other commitments that we've made for this fiscal year, and not reduce service delivery, because again, these small, tiny cuts won't close this gap that we have of $900,000. So that leads, and so that's part one. Part two is thinking about effective strategies for working with the legislature, working with the governor's office. As noted at the last meeting, working with Judge Marsico and Representative Krajewski and others from the commission, I think we pretty much exhausted everything we could have done starting in January of this calendar year moving forward. We didn't have the opportunity to meet with the governor's office before the governor's budget came out, but we kind of started, I would say, in February of thinking about our strategies. So we met with the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate. We met with the judiciary in the House and Senate. We met with the Speaker of the House. We met with lots of leadership, phone calls, letter writing, getting our external agencies like the DOC who wrote a letter of support for us. So I think this is our reality, and I would love to get a little bit of feedback from commission members, thinking both about our current operations, if that makes sense to continue operations, as if we had a whole budget, and then thinking about strategies for the next fiscal year to make us whole and recover these reserves, but also have enough funding to move forward to cover our full operating budget.
All right. Obviously, it's not good news. We failed miserably, but, Matt was new to it, but was all in, meeting with people and talking to people in Harrisburg, our legislative folks, Representative Krajewski, Representative Bonner, Senator Street, did what they could. Judge Daly is head of our Conference of State Trial Judges Legislative Committee, and obviously is an ex-legislator. And Judge Daly can talk maybe just for a minute about even the courts fell short with what.
It was better than previous year.
We did better for the courts overall, but the courts did not get what they asked for either in the last budget. Judge, I don't know if you want to talk about strategies or any of that legislatively.
Well, I think it seems like the breakdown is on the House side. That's my
I think
opinion. I mean,
I think we need better outreach to the governor's office.
yeah, that as well.
I think that's something we have to do. And in the Senate, we've talked a little bit about, making some inroads there.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some different strategies we can kick around with the Senate majority to try and get some things done. Look, this is a pittance in the budget, and that's what's so annoying about it, is the ask was not for much. It's been all these years of flat funding. They're sitting on a boatload of money in Harrisburg for once. And we just couldn't get a bite at the apple. How do we, I don't know if we need to raise awareness, if we, we are a legislative committee, which is even more frustrating.
Exactly.
That we should be funded by the legislature, and we get funding from Penn State that takes away a lot of things that otherwise would be the responsibility of state government. With that said, I think we're open to any suggestions. I think we're going to start early here, coming up here in the fall. Obviously, there's going to be turnover with the elections this year in the House and Senate. We don't know the makeup of that. Speaker of the House is a former member of this commission. She was supportive, and again, to Mr. Daly's point, the breakdown, I think was not in the House, but in the Senate and in the governor's office. So whatever suggestions anybody has, we're certainly open to.
Judge, if I can just jump in real quick to just provide just some perspective. And I'll just echo what everyone said. Matt really hit the pavement, and we went on a whole, legislative tour where we basically met with everyone and their mother in the state house to, talk with them about the importance of the commission and the budget. And, I think, as has already been stated, the unfortunate reality is we are a nonpartisan body that was entering a partisan process. And when you're in a partisan process, anything can be on the chopping block. And so I think, one of the things I'm reflecting on is just how, as has been said, there was a breakdown in being able to create true bipartisanship and support for the appropriation increase. And so I just think it's about how do we get ahead of the timeline and reaching out to all sides of the negotiating table before it starts to get into the real, partisanship tit for tat. And I think that's really just a matter of time. So I think if we can, sit down with all the parties we need to sit down with before things start to heat up and the negotiations start to happen, and then you start having the kind of, hardball, we can try to get that alignment beforehand so that, this appropriation request, because you're right, Judge, it's really, it's basically a rounding error in comparison to some of the other numbers we're talking about when it comes to the budget. But because I think we entered it at a time where things were already getting pretty partisan, unfortunately, that was a side effect. So I just think if we adjust our timing and if we try to get in early and getting some agreement on the appropriation support, we might be able to circumvent some of that stuff. So,
How did the commission fare relative to other legislative agencies?
I think there was, just speaking, and I know the Senator Street's on the call. I know Rep. Bonner can provide his perspective as well. I think everything was potentially subject to a haircut, just to let you know, in terms of trying to get the request, but also I think there was a balance between trying to fund agencies, but also not trying to overspend because of concerns about the rainy day fund and some of the reserve funds. So I think I don't think what happened to the commission was in a silo, or particularly just about the commission. I think there was a lot of back and forth. Sorry, Rep. Bonner, were you gonna say something? Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I have nothing to add to.
All right, is there, anyone else that wants to weigh in on this? Certainly, we can tap into the legislative reserve fund. It's a lot more than $700,000. I can tell you that.
Good luck.
Just get a little bit of that for that rainy day that they have, but I'll hold my tongue. All right, well, thanks. And I think it's something between Representative Krajewski, our legislative members, Matt, myself, and I'll probably tap Judge Dally. We can get working on this here in the fall.
Yeah.
I'm happy to help out, so.
Good, thanks, Judge. Appellate court, I think,
Yeah,
would help.
and perhaps we, maybe Damien can lend his services. The OPC allows it. Yeah.
We can work that through them.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and as was just noted, I'm gonna loop in or connect with Representative Krajewski next week, and we'll start marching forward into the fall with meeting with the governor's office and having these other meetings. So in the landscape of these kind of bad budget situation, as you know, occasionally we receive resolutions to do a bunch of work for the legislature. Recently, we had HR 111, which looked at violation of Uniform Firearm Acts, and now we have Senate Resolution 196, which looks at the veterans involved in the criminal justice system. So I want to give a brief overview of our work in that space and what we've done so far, and just to provide an overview, and as I mentioned in the intro, to have our guest speaker provide some contextual background for all of us to learn a lot about a space that's new for the commission, and so I'll go into some detail on the project. Our resolution, the resolution was amended and passed on June 4th, 2024. The resolution directed the commission to conduct a thorough and comprehensive study on the effects that post-traumatic stress disorder or injury, military sexual trauma, and traumatic brain injury have on service members, veterans, and their families who are directly or indirectly involved or implicated in any portion or component of the criminal justice system. So a pretty broad directive, at least in the intro. Fortunately, there are 8 specific directives that I'll cover later and talk about our strategy for addressing those directives. We are working with partner agencies already, from the Department of Corrections, Department of Military and Veteran Affairs, the Administrative Office of the Courts. We'll be reaching out to PCCD and also the Attorney General's Office, and so far our partner agencies have been fantastic in providing us access and data that we've requested, and so we look forward to continuing to work with them on this project. There we go. The last part of the resolution worth highlighting, as you remember, the original draft said 6 months. Thankfully, the Senate was willing to change this to 15 months. So this project will be completed September 2025. 6 months was an impossibility. 15 months certainly gives us enough time, as you'll see, to do all the things we were interested in doing. As you might remember, we started on this project even before we received the resolution with concern that the 6-month timeline would be enacted. So we did some background work already, but really our first key event was establishing an advisory committee. We sought to have representation geographically, but also, of course, across key stakeholders in the system, from those directly involved with veterans, be it the Veterans Treatment Court, the Veterans Treatment Court team, a coordinator and a judge, to the VA and the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, but also folks involved in the criminal justice system who interact with veterans but are not specifically related to programs for veterans. So a district attorney, court of common pleas judge, someone from the Senate, and of course Representative Krajewski. And I want to thank Representative Bonner for serving as the chair of this important committee. And so we had our first meeting on August 15th, and during that meeting, the commission staff presented sort of our research plan related to this project that I'll share with you briefly. But I also think it was really important each stakeholder and member of the committee presented for 5 to 10 minutes talking about their roles and their experience working with veterans in the criminal justice system, which helped us as staff frame our approach in thinking about this issue and led to having Mr. Negreanu join us in a few moments to speak about the role of the Veterans Administration, and he plays a crucial role on that committee as well. So just some basic statistics for some context here. There's 18 million living veterans. A little over 6% of the adult population is made up of veterans. This is across the whole United States. 1 in 5 have PTSD. Among female veterans seen in VA providers, rates of military sexual trauma are 1 in 3, about 1 in 50, and then nearly 1 in 3 veterans report having been arrested and booked in their lifetime, while less than 1 in 5 civilians report having been arrested. So in Pennsylvania, of course, every county has veterans living in them. There is a range, essentially between 4 to 10% of the population being veterans, but statewide, a little over 6.5% of adults living in these counties are veterans. So we don't have any statistics on the proportion of veterans involved in the criminal justice system, and I'll get into that briefly about the challenges we're confronting related to our data. But it is notable that Pennsylvania has the 4th largest population of veterans in the country in terms of raw numbers, not necessarily per capita. So when we began this project, Fred Miller and Noah Painter-Davis, the folks in the Research and Data Analysis Unit, wanted to find a framework that would help us with our investigation, something that could provide us a way to design our, think about our research design, the collection of data, and an overall framework. And we came across something called the Veteran Sequential Intercept Model. I think Mr. Negreanu also will be referencing this about the role of this model as it relates to the VA. But this was developed by the National Institute of Corrections with working with SAMHSA. And I'll skip the middle quote, but the one that was most interesting to us was that the sequential intercept model is most effective when used as a community strategic planning tool to assess available resources, determine gaps in service, and plan for community change. So this framework that I'll go through very quickly in a few moments allows us to make this assessment of what is being done in the Commonwealth in regards to veterans at each different phase, what resources are available at these different phases, and then thinking about what the best practices are to overlay on top of that about what could or should be being done at those different phases. This is the intercept model itself. There's 6 different intercepts starting at 0. I'll just walk through them really fast. What's appealing about this model as compared to other models that focus solely on the criminal justice system, usually police interaction or arrest is the start of those models. What made this model intriguing and interesting is it starts before arrest, and it's thinking about what resources are in communities that could be leveraged to deflect veterans to some sort of treatment, during crisis, to avoid being arrested and having involvement in the criminal justice system. So this intercept 0 and 1 is really pre-involvement with the criminal justice system. Of course, then this purple line is the involvement with the justice system and the arrest. And that brings us then to the second intercept. And intercept 2 is thinking about initial detention and first appearance. And one of the main themes, and I think Mr. Negreanu will echo this as well, is how to identify veterans early in the system or early in the process, and then what could be done to assist them, divert them, let's say even at this initial detention, thinking about what the individual's needs that they have, be it substance involvement or mental health issues, and addressing those starting very early in the process. Then we move to this jail and courts intercept, which includes things like the Veterans Treatment Court, but also our sanctions of jail, prison, and probation. So what programmings are available, let's say, at the DOC for veterans. But all of this, again, is dependent upon identifying veterans, that an individual is a veteran, to be involved in any of these programming components. And I'll talk specifically later about probation and jail and so forth. Then there's just a focus here on reentry issues. And finally, for those who were incarcerated under supervision back in the community, be it parole or probation, thinking again about what their needs are Mr. Negrea will talk about an important component of this, which is both screening tools and assessment tools to identify these needs of veterans. So I apologize for the tedious part of this, but the directive that I showed, the Senate resolution, just wanted to walk through the 8 directives that we have. So it asks us to identify each criminal case from 2016 to 2021 in which the offender is identified as a veteran, and I can't read the rest of the language, but including things like the severity of the offense, the grade, the offense gravity score, the prior record score, and the disposition. So a number of these we're able to leverage commission data, but also utilizing the Administrative Office of the Pennsylvania Courts data. And the challenge we have is that the courts have a flag for veteran status, but it is probably not very reliable. CCS, we do not have a flag for veterans. So one of our big challenges here is matching our data to a repository through the VA, a system called VRSS, that has a flag for individuals who are veterans. So we'll merge and match and then hopefully be able to say something about in our data who's a veteran. This will be a really important part of this project because, as I mentioned earlier, we do not know how many veterans are involved in the criminal justice system since we don't have a flag for veteran status. I think longer term in this project is similar to what I noted of where is this identification being done and whose responsibility, and then who's noting this into a data repository in Pennsylvania moving forward that would allow other groups, of course, like for the DOC, where there's a formal intake process, they have the opportunity to interview these individuals at intake to determine veteran status. But thinking about people who are not sentenced to state prison differently. So then, number of criminal offenders summoned to a Veterans Treatment Court. We could get that information from the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts. We need to develop costs to establish additional Veterans Treatment Courts across the Commonwealth. Some of that cost, of course, will be, or thinking about a barrier if you're a very small county. What if none of the judges want to do this? There's sort of a willingness factor as well as the monetary cost of whatever that's involved in. Number 4, number of criminal offenders identified as veterans that committed 2 or more offenses were rising out of the same criminal case. Again, that would be our administrative data. The current consideration of each criminal offender identified as a veteran with PTSD or PTSI, military sexual trauma or traumatic brain injury during sentencing in this Commonwealth and nationwide. So we plan to, and I'll get to this later, do surveys of judges to understand, again, how they're being identified, what information is being provided to the judge. This is not for Veterans Treatment Court. This is just for regular sentencing hearings in the Court of Common Pleas, but also find out the best practices. Again, this relates back to that screening and assessment. What information is provided to the judge? For example, we have our current risk assessment tool that suggests for those identified as low or high risk by the tool that the courts seek additional information to provide to the judge prior to sentencing through the form of a validated risk or needs assessment or some sort of pre-sentence investigation. So there is a possibility here and working with the commission to think about strategies to get additional information to the judge about the veteran and the veteran's needs prior to sentencing. This, again, the number 6 relates to that identification issue. Where are they being identified? When are they being identified? In the Court of Common Pleas, and then, of course, by state or county correctional institutions. Number 7 is the potential impacts on the criminal justice system and the timeliness of sentencing if courts are mandated to complete a clinical assessment of each criminal offender identified as a veteran and so forth, when a professional clinician does not already, or professional clinical assessment does not already exist. I think some of these themes are very similar to issues we talked about related to domestic violence pretrial risk assessment. And the idea was what resources are available early in that process and who can assess that. So every county is not going to have a trained social worker potentially available who could do a full clinical assessment. So are there other sort of screening tools? And Mr. Negrea will certainly talk about some of the possibilities and some of the work he's done in the Commonwealth of thinking about collecting this type of information, essentially following arrest. And then finally, the current healthcare or treatment options available while incarcerated in state or county correctional institution to address PTSD, PTSI, and so forth. So that is the 8 directives that frame the report that we will be generating and our work. So I just want to walk through this timeline, but this timeline also serves as our research plan. And I want to apologize for the tiny print here, but I'll just walk you through. As I mentioned, we really started our background research in the spring and summer of last year, even before the resolution passed. Once the resolution passed, we began planning and working on developing this advisory board that, as I mentioned, met in August and gave us really our path forward for this project. So we're working heavily right now on this administrative data collection component, as I mentioned, trying to get these flags that show that an individual in our data is a veteran or not a veteran, so we can make comparisons. And also I answer those directives related to our data. We're very optimistic that this thing called the Veterans Reentry Search Services through the VA, the VRSS, will be our key for that. If not, we may have to pivot and utilize Department of Motor Vehicle records or be seeking other institutions that may have identifiers of veteran status that we can link to our data in some shape or format. So I do want to highlight that this project plan is what we would call a mixed methods approach. So it's going to be relying on administrative data. We're also going to be doing site visits. So we have our first visit scheduled the end of this month. We'll be going to Allegheny County, and I want to thank Janice Dean, who's in court administration, I think the head of the criminal division of court administration, Allegheny County, helping us schedule all these meetings. We'll be meeting with the Veterans Treatment Court team and the judge. We'll be meeting with DA, probation, pretrial services, Court of Common Pleas judge, a few magisterial district court judges, meet with the warden and folks at the jail, and et cetera. So it'll be a really broad set of stakeholders with the thinking that Allegheny probably has some of the most robust services of any county in the Commonwealth. So that could be our starting point for understanding what is done. We'll be meeting with folks from Duquesne Law School who work at the clinic and some other work that Professor Mystic and his colleagues have spearheaded and are spearheading in Allegheny County as well. So in addition to these site visits, and our thinking is we're going to do 3 visits. We would like to do a urban, suburban, and rural county. We haven't identified the other 2 yet. We'll be working with the committee and also through our contacts to try to identify representative places. And in this case, we don't always want to go to a county that has the most robust services. We also want to visit ones that might be representative of counties who don't have a lot of things going on for veterans, because I think this initiative is to think about ways to fill those gaps. So we're considering one here in central Pennsylvania for a rural, and then a jurisdiction on the east side of the state for our suburban county, and more to come on those sites once we get through the Allegheny visit and have a better sense of what we're doing. And then the other components, there's 2 other components of this, is there are going to be key interviews with individuals. So at the DOC, one of our members of the advisory committee is a gentleman, Mike Carrington. Mr. Carrington is responsible for all of the veteran-based programming in the units at the DOC. So if one of our directives is, what is the DOC doing? Mr. Carrington can provide us with that information. So there's a couple of key folks at the Veteran Administration, the Department of Military and Veteran Affairs that we'll be speaking to. But we also hope to deploy some statewide surveys, maybe for every warden of the county jails, to understand what programming is done at the county jails. We may do it also for judges, as I mentioned, Court of Common Pleas judges across the Commonwealth, to get an understanding of what they do. So this will all come together in the summer with our draft report, and again, working closely with the committee, but working, of course, briefing the commission at the quarterly commission meetings on our progress. It's possible in December we'll be able to present some of this administrative data analysis that we do, but that's contingent upon this flag being generated and how easy. If not, that'll be in March, but certainly we'll report back on the site visit in Allegheny, as well as any sort of survey work that we do. So before I turn it to the guest speaker, I don't know, Representative Bonner or Representative Krajewski, if you wanted to say anything about this work and the work of the advisory committee.
I'll just, quickly say I just appreciate the intentionality you all have brought to doing this project. I know on the front end, it was a very hefty responsibility. And so I just appreciate the partnership between the commission and Rep. Bonner as the chair in trying to think about how to do this in a thoughtful way. And I'm excited for using this as a template for other potential areas of research for, the ways in which mental health and trauma impacts, certain identities that enter the criminal legal system. So, yeah, thank you for your work on this.
Okay, so I think this will be a great opportunity and time to transition to our guest speaker, Mr. Negreanu, and hoping that he'll provide a pretty brief presentation of 20 or 30 minutes, and then we would love to have questions and conversation with him, given that we have an expert here who knows a lot about the topic and worked in this field for a very long time. So Mr. Negreanu, again, is a Veterans Justice Outreach Coordinator from Lebanon County with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So, let's see, I guess.
You have power. You can use the down key, or you can use this.
Oops, what am I going on? There we go. So I'll try and be brief, but I tried to make everything as condensed as possible, and I see some familiar faces. Judge Marsico. Well, so again, my name's Joe Negre. It's a common name, I know. Yeah, I don't think I've even met another Joe. So, anyway, a little bit about myself. I'm also a veteran, Marine Corps. I was deployed. A little bit about my background. I currently work at the VA Medical Center out of Lebanon, and I'm one of the Veterans Justice Outreach Specialists there. And what I do is, I'll talk about what VJO is, but at one point I did cover 6 counties in Pennsylvania. I've worked with 8 separate counties where I've been part of 4 veterans teams in the last 10 years. So I've been working in veterans justice for a while, and prior to that I worked as a therapist, specialized in combat trauma. So that's my background, is treating trauma. A little bit of history of what VJO is, because I'm not sure. I know sometimes when you're in the field, you feel everybody knows what you do and everything, so I wasn't sure how familiar everybody here is with what a Veterans Justice Outreach Specialist is. And basically, the VJO program has been around since 2009, and it's grown quite a bit since then. And again, the initiative began because the VA noticed that a lot of veterans were homeless once they got in trouble with the justice system. And if you look at the statistics, that's one of the biggest factors for homelessness, is if a veteran gets involved with the justice system, they automatically become at risk for homeless, or in most cases. So that's where that initiative started. The program expanded over time because, again, in 2009, there were no vet courts in Pennsylvania. My understanding is that the first vet court in Pennsylvania was Berks in 2010. There's some dispute there with two courts, claiming to be the first, but I don't know. But it's around 2010 was the first. I believe it was Burke's, but I'm not, there's some dispute there. Anyway, sure.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but,
I prefer questions, please.
okay, so you mentioned that if a veteran gets tangled up in the judicial system, then they're more likely to end up homeless. Do you know why that is?
The loss of housing, jobs. So once you're incarcerated, oftentimes if you're incarcerated, you're missing work. You don't even get to notify your employer.
Okay.
You can't pay your bills. You
So it's
can't
the
pay rent.
incarceration, not necessarily just getting in trouble.
Yes, so it's once the incarceration happens, and then there's a lot of stigma, getting jobs, a lot of different things trying to rebuild. But once they get incarcerated, that's one of the things. It also puts them at, it's also one of the highest risk factors for suicide in veterans as well, because loss of family, loss of relationships, there's a lot that goes in around it. So when you're in the justice system, you're seeing what happens, but on the back end, how that affects the person's entire system it affects it in a lot of different ways.
Thank you.
No problem, and please, any questions, feel free, because sometimes I could ramble, so. And Matt, if I forget anything that I know we talked about, please ask me. I know there's a lot of things I want to touch on. So anyway, right now, Lebanon covers 9 counties, and we have 5 vet courts, possibly 6 with Perry County being involved in a vet court as well. So that one's up and coming. Some of the things that we do is, I'll just basically mention it real quick. What a VJO does, we have 2 components. One component is when a veteran gets in trouble with the justice system while they're incarcerated, so they're not sentenced, they're charged, we could go out there to the prison or to the county prison and assess that individual. So we could do a full assessment on the individual and come up with treatment recommendations. And what we are is, for example, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and what that means, I could screen, assess, and diagnose. So that is a resource that could be used, and every county in Pennsylvania has a VJO that covers that county, every single county. So that's something that, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but it's maybe a little bit underutilized. Because when people that know about VJOs, they tend to associate us with the vet court, which is a big part of what we do. And what we do in the Veterans Court team is, again, we assess their treatment needs, we develop their treatment plans, we get them connected to services through the VA, and then we monitor that treatment progress along with running some groups. So, for example, I run like moral recognition therapy groups, and I do different things like that. But that's something that I guess is more widely known, and it seems like the prison part, that the outreach part, is maybe a little bit underutilized. So I just want to mention that part of it. And that's just my observations in the counties that I've worked, but again, I talked a little bit about this. We do work with the probation officers as well. So a lot of the times if a probation officer has a veteran, they're not quite in vet court, they don't quite meet criteria, I'll work with that PO and we'll develop a treatment plan, and I'll still give, updates on how they're doing in treatment, so I could still assist in that capacity. Let's see. Veterans, okay, so one of the things that this is actually important here is when a veteran is incarcerated, they belong to that facility, so they do not get full medical care from the VA at that point. What they get is the VJO that could come in there and assess them, and they'd have to be released to get full medical care. The VA cannot take custody of an inmate, essentially. We cannot do that. We could treat them if they're released from there. So that's just an important point I would like to make. And again, please, any questions, feel free. So now this is an important topic here that I know it was touched on before, but what is a veteran is very difficult It's something I see every county, and again, I've worked with 8 separate counties, and they almost all have their own definition. And even within the counties, it's, even the agencies within the county seem to classify that differently on what a veteran is and how you describe a veteran. So, for example, the VA generally because you could be eligible for VA care, being eligible for VA care versus being a veteran is not always the same thing. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but for example, they usually use what the VA, and I won't go into because they have lots of pages on what a veteran is, but basically 2 years of active service other than training or 1 day of combat would get you VA eligibility and called a veteran. But there's a lot of cases, that somebody maybe gets out early and it's medically discharged because they got injured in boot camp or different things like that. So then they could be VA eligible under that criteria. So it gets very complicated on that VA eligibility part. And again, every agency has their own definition. I mean, there's agencies that 1 day of military service and they call somebody a veteran. So again, it's all over the place. So when everyone's discussing, number of veterans, it's important to know what exactly it is that you're trying to count. That's a difficult piece. And oftentimes veterans themselves do not know that they are veterans. That's, even that terminology. When I first got back myself, I did not know I fell under the veteran umbrella, and I just got back from Iraq, for example. I was like, I didn't know that. So one of the appropriate questions to ask to try and capture that is, did you serve in the military? That's more the appropriate question rather than, are you a veteran? Because you ask, are you a veteran? Half may not know it. So anyway, maybe asking, how many people served in the military that you're trying to track rather than the term veteran, which could get confusing. So again, I don't want to get into too much of that because there's just so many discussions, and even every one VEC I worked with, in order to be eligible, they had to be VA eligible. That was it. That was the hard criteria. If you're VA eligible, you could get in. If you're not, doesn't matter, you can't get in. And the part that is difficult with that is, let's say if a veteran comes out, never has any issues with the justice system, gets a good job, even if they were deployed, after 5 years, they lose their VA eligibility if they never used it after a combat zone, and then they have a good job. Well, now they exceed the income threshold for services. So let's say now they get in trouble with the justice system the first time ever, but their income still shows a certain level. Well, now they're not VA eligible. So they have to go to jail, lose their job, be homeless to become VA eligible. So it's really a difficult situation there.
But is that the only way you can become VA eligible, is commit a crime?
No.
But you can still be involved.
Right, so what I'm talking about is, and most of the veterans that we don't see in the justice system do the right thing. We don't see most of them in the justice system. So let's say somebody's deployed, they do 4 years of active service, they come back, they're doing great, everything's fine. They never needed the VA for anything, and now they have a good job that makes good money, which is what they should do, right? Be part of the community. They come back, well, now they could exceed the income threshold for VA services at that time. Now, they could have, if they would have gone in, if they had issues and they would have gone in to the VA within that 5-year window, they'd automatically have been eligible.
Is there anything else they could do?
Yeah, one of the other things, so if they're having issues, if they're screened for any medical conditions, they could apply for a service-connected disability, which what that means is they could still work full-time, do everything, and they could then get all of their health care paid for by the VA and still have whatever income level they need. So there are other ways, but it just, I've seen it happen where veterans, unfortunately, they did the right thing, now they're not eligible, so then I had to work with them to get them rated, service-connected rating, and we have to wait until then they could get a VEC court, which is difficult. So, but then there's other courts that if somebody served 1 day, they're accepting them as a veteran. even if they're not VA eligible, and then the county's providing the
Well,
service.
it seems like there needs to be something statewide, so that it's the same county to county.
I
It shouldn't
agree.
be treated differently
I
in different counties.
I completely agree. It's just what I'm observing is what I'm seeing is kind of all over the place. Now,
And are you talking about those criteria to get into Veterans Court?
they've used it for Veterans Court, yes.
Okay.
So it's different, and again, the criteria to get into Veterans Court is basically vet court to vet court.
Right.
Each vet court runs their own program, so each vet court determines their own criteria,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. I mean, it's essentially a diversionary program, kind of at the mercy of the court and the DA's office. So, I mean, they could, if they want to say, hey, you were in the military for a week, we're going to put you in here. I mean,
Yeah.
you
And
know what I
most
mean?
times they're run by judges who were veterans.
Veterans,
Who are
yeah.
veterans.
Literally everyone, and I sit in our Veterans Court as much as I can. I think every person is a veteran, except for me. I think every single
Yeah.
person, even the ADA that goes most of the time, and the judge.
And,
Yeah, so again, I just wanted to mention, because there is, when you're on one team, you really get focused on that's how it works for all teams, but it's not.
Sure.
When you actually go and work with a lot of teams, you get to see a lot of differences that, and again, there's reasons for that. Some maybe they need that VA resource because they don't have a budget, so they have to rely on that. So it's not that they're trying to exclude, but that's all they have.
Sure.
So there's a lot of different reasons. I'm not bashing one or the other. It's more of there's differences in what a veteran is and even how vet courts accept people.
I have a question. It goes back to what you said earlier. You said that we're going to use the VRSS to match veterans in the system.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Just previously, you said we were going to use the VRSS to match veterans in the system. What definition are they using for that, to match them up?
We'll bring it out. Whatever the VRSS definition is the definition we'll have to use for our administrative data. And I don't know, maybe one of these two.
But that's going to throw a big monkey wrench in how you move forward with that.
Correct. I mean, we're gonna have to, exactly what Mr. Negrea said, specify the definition that was imposed upon us by the VRSS. That doesn't mean the rest of the study, when we're talking the jails or prisons or probation, a different definition, more expansive, but at least from the administrative data that we're gonna use, we can only utilize the definition of this external agency they use. But an important point, and I think what you said is holds true.
Yeah. So now the next part is how veterans are identified in the justice system. Well, that's a very good question. So, a lot of it is self-referral, but they have to know that a VJO is available. A lot of it is from county prison staff, booking, did you serve in the military, referred by treatment providers, self-identification, and this is where I would like to touch on that. In 2018 and 2019, I was working on an initiative for statewide to try and get every booking center to ask, did you serve in the military? And to have a mechanism that from there, they would get sent to the VJO that covers their county, who could verify their service, because we don't use the VRRS system, we use different systems that are tied directly to DOD, where we could identify exactly their military service, because I've heard that there's some, I don't know how accurate the VRRS system is, so I can't really speak to that, but I know as VJOs, we can give you right from DOD's records what their military service is and if they're VA eligible or not. So every county has that resource. So at the time I was working on the booking project, it actually, my leadership at the VISN level, which is covering the whole state, they were very excited about doing something like that. And they were even willing to hire one or two people to strictly answer those calls for the entire state, everything, just to centralize it, that somebody, that's all they would do is do that. But it was hard to get the counties to respond. Some counties responded, others did not, so it was very difficult to, and then even when there was personnel changeovers, it seemed to fade away. So it was really hard to get that off the ground, and that was just some of the challenges that I've seen to identify. But again, in my opinion, that would be the most definitive way to catch and identify veterans, as you asked that.
So I agree, I think that would be a booking, but there's also a lot of defendants that are never booked. You know, that they're charged to send out summons, DUIs, I think of predominantly, you know, how do we, you know, I'm thinking as a judge, now Judge McLaughlin, when she was on the bench in Philly, Judge Dowling, you know, how do we know, if someone's coming before us, if the defense attorney doesn't tell me, I have no idea. Or, yeah, if somebody's a pro se and they don't say it, or if they're pro se and they make it up, I don't know it either. You know, I think that's a huge issue. I love the idea of it at booking, but still get it in front of us in the court then becomes a headache.
So what we do, judges, on our plea memos, at the preliminary hearings, we have a little box that says, are you a veteran, yes or no?
Okay.
We try, I mean, most of the cases are from the public defender's office, so we try to instill it in them to ask your clients.
Right.
But I mean, I try to tell my ADAs as well, like, hey, check, you know, double check, but I mean, still tons fall through the cracks still with that, but, at least it's kind of, you know, right at that initial stage, trying to nip it, and then we put them, you know, if they are and they're eligible, then we try to divert them into veterans court if we can.
And what hurts us, like with the state, when these guys come upstate, to self-report it, they don't self-report it. Usually, we don't find out until the back end when they are homeless, when they don't have a home plan, they're maxing out, and then we're scampering around to try to find a placement for them, not knowing they were a veteran the whole time, and we could have plugged them in with services.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and Judge, I don't have a good answer as far as capturing all. I was thinking the booking, because that's at least a way of getting a lot of the ones that go
No,
there.
it's good.
But, as far as everything, I don't know, there's always a lot of work to be done, and it's just, it just seems to be, it seems like such a simple thing, like, how many veterans do we have? But then again, there's a lot of challenges in that, and it starts from the definition to on down. And really, and I'll talk to probably, one, many veterans do not realize that they're veterans, and this is difficulties identifying. Approximately 50% of eligible veterans use the VA healthcare, which means 50% of eligible veterans do not use the VA. That's actually gone up. It used to be only 40% used to use it. It's about 50% now. But, and I frequently see this when I get referrals for vet court or go and see them in one of the county prisons. I may be the first interaction or the first person that they've that they've ever encountered from the VA. And at that point, that's another thing that we could do is we could have them enrolled in the VA basically on the spot. Well, not quite, but get the ball started to get them enrolled even while they're incarcerated, so then they could transition to treatment right after. But, yeah, so a lot of veterans are in the justice system and they've never been, they've never established any care for the VA, and half the veterans out there don't use the VA. So,
I just want to make one point about the data piece. So I think that just to make the distinction, so it seems like the VJOs can look up an individual in this system for the EOD. We're going to have 6 years of data, give or take 500,000 people. So we can't look up 500,000 people. So we need to send a list and have it through this repository. So there may be more accurate, better ways to use a restricted or a more expansive definition, but we just need a unified source that has it, that we can, statistical ways to match, not spending the rest of our life looking up each person, 500,000. Every undergrad is responsible for 100 names or something, you know. But
I had a difficult time, and Judge, you would remember Catherine. So when I was pushing for the, and I'll try not to, when I was going for the central booking to, or booking to ask the question, Catherine got me all of the veterans that encountered the justice system from 2014 to 19 in Dauphin County that they were able to identify, and it was like 2,200. And out of those 2,200, there might have been repeats because it was just me going through the data. So again, I was having, but out of that, I believe 400 were VA eligible, and most were never referred to, like 225 were never referred to anything. That were VA eligible. Forget about all the other ones. So it's hard. It's been an ongoing issue for a long time. So I'm really glad that it's being looked at now.
Well, I think it is a good look at it. I think it's educational for all of us in the criminal justice system. Judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, you know, all of us to do what we can to identify that probation, parole, prison. It doesn't, you know, they fall through the cracks for years, so it makes sense to do what we can.
Yeah, and again, like I said before, as far as identifying the individuals, every county has a VJO. So that could be used to identify and help the counties there, and they'd be more than happy to work up a system. It could be a weekly thing, going through a list. It could be, I don't know, different ways. Whatever works for that county, they'd be probably more than happy to assist. Now, some of the bigger counties would probably have a lot more challenges, but they also have more VJOs. Like I'm thinking Philadelphia with they have like a lot more VJOs there.
They also have a lot of other veterans organizations that are, I know,
Mhm.
Veterans Multi-Service Center I'm very active with, and they do a lot of outreach.
Mhm. Yeah, and they work with us too. We work with all those different organizations. I guess now one of the things switching gears a little bit, I was going to talk about screenings versus assessments, because oftentimes they're used interchangeably, but they are not. You know, a screening tool is very simple. It's brief. I think I handed one out. That one is a common one that's used by the VA to screen for post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a simple 17-question that they have. And there's also like a sheet, if they score above like 50%, then they screen positive for PTSD. That does not mean that they're diagnosed with PTSD, and screening tools are not used to diagnose. They're simply something to recognize that, hey, there might be a problem here that we need to look at. That's really what a screening tool is and it's designed to do. So screening tools, you know, could be suicide prevention screenings, it could be PTSD screenings, MST, depression. There's a lot of different screening tools. This one specifically, this is probably the most common one, this PCL that you see for PTSD, and it's used to also give you a baseline on what the symptoms are, and then as it continues, you could monitor symptoms to see if they go up or down. You know, so it's very simple. You do not have to be a clinician to do a screening, but they should be trained in how to properly use the screening tool. So this could be used by staff members and probably county prisons, wherever they could be used a screening tool. But again, some training would be required, and that's for any screening tool. An assessment is a lot longer, and that takes a lot more time, and an assessment should be completed by a clinician that could actually do an assessment to identify the different needs. So I like to use screening tools to help me pinpoint what areas to look at when I do an assessment. So that's kind of the benefit of the screening versus an assessment. And again, an assessment, when you do it, it gives you a more complete picture, and that's where you could develop a diagnosis from there. So that's one of the differences between screening and assessment. So I try not to bore you guys too much with that stuff.
What would a training for this PCL for staff look like? How, would it be?
A couple hours, 2 hours maybe. You could train somebody in an afternoon how to do that. As long as they're aware, and that one of the pitfalls is for either facilities or individuals or whoever not to assume that it's the diagnosis then, because it's real easy. Oh, they're this, they're positive. You get to the third person, oh, they have PTSD. That's going to say it, where this is just a simple screening. When you're actually doing an assessment, it takes more time to actually develop a diagnosis. I don't like to do a diagnosis in one session. It should be 2-3 sessions at least, especially with PTSD, where somebody's very sensitive when they've experienced trauma to even share things. You'd want to take your time and almost the first session just build rapport. Just build that rapport so that there could be a level of trust to do that. So that's why, if you do it almost like an automated, you're going to get people that over-report and people that under-report. you know, and you're gonna be all over the place. So, but a screening tool will give the baseline that then a clinician could look further into it.
So, Julie, you said you're a clinician,
Yes,
and so you're able to do the screenings and the assessments.
yes.
Is that true of all VJOs?
Most, I would say almost all. Yes, they could all do assessments, I should say, they could all do assessments, but you have to be an LCSW to do a diagnosis. So some are not LCSWs, but all could do an assessment as well, because they're all at least LSWs. If that makes sense.
LCSW would be a licensed
Clinical social worker.
Clinical social worker.
And licensed social workers are still clinicians, but they're training for their clinical license. They could still do assessments, but they won't be able to give the diagnosis. So, but yes, every VJO could do that. So again, if somebody's incarcerated at the county prison, VJO covers it. If they know about it, they could go out there and do this for the county. They could do the screening and the assessment. Okay, next I'm going to talk a little bit about PTSD because I think there's also a lot of misconceptions about post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is not really a new problem. The first reported symptoms of PTSD were actually by an Egyptian physician almost 2000 BC, so about 1900 BC. But it did take a while to become an official diagnosis, which was in 1980 in the DSM-3 manual is when it first became recognized. Before that, it was viewed as an individual's personal failing. So it was almost like they couldn't handle it, or it had a lot of different names over the years. Shell shock being one, battle fatigue, mother syndrome, soldier's heart in the Civil War. There's a lot of different names that it had over the years. So, but post-traumatic stress disorder was, 1980 was when it was first officially accepted. And really that was brought on from the Vietnam veteran population because they saw so many. And again, I'll try not to bore, but one of the questions I've heard over the years is, well, how come now there's so many more veterans with PTSD than before? And what about the World War II veterans? You know, how did they handle it? Well, if you've gone to different VA centers, for example, Lebanon, now it's grown around it, but it used to be in the middle of nowhere in cornfields, and they used to warehouse veterans that had problems. It used to be like a 1,700-bed facility. So if a veteran had a problem, they would take him from the community and warehouse him. The community did not see the veteran with a problem. So that gave the illusion that those veterans did not have problems. Whereas now they're actually in the community, in the courtroom, getting in trouble, doing different things. So anyway, I did want to mention that because I feel like I've seen that happen a lot. I've received that question, I should say. I won't go through too much of the definition, just a little bit. So essentially, an individual has to experience a traumatic event, and not just experience it, because lots of people experience traumatic events. Probably everybody in this room has experienced it. It doesn't mean you have PTSD. What happens is how you react to that, and how you react to it in the short term, and then after that. So the longer you have these symptoms, that normally would dissipate. So it's the fight or flight response that gets triggered in the brain, basically, and then you can't turn it off. So for example, a lot of individuals or veterans, you know, they're basically in the restaurant with their back to the wall, all this other stuff. And just one thing here, what happens in post-traumatic stress disorder, let's say somebody, waiter, waitress, whoever walks by, you pick them up with the corner of your eye, the fight or flight response occurs because the primitive part of the brain. That individual now is reacting. They're physiologically ready to respond to a perceived danger. They look there logically, they say, oh, there's no danger. Well, that doesn't stop your body that now already reacted. So now they may not be that nice to be around. Now they could be with their family and they're argumentative, miserable, all this other stuff. So that happens multiple times a day where it becomes the norm. So that's essentially, that causes also a lot of physical problems. So most individuals with PTSD don't go there with a neon sign saying, hey, I have PTSD. It's actually more common for them to go and seek out treatment from like primary care for headaches or stomach issues or different things like that, which is a response to their body constantly going up and down like that and reacting to it. Challenging aspects, admitting that they have a problem, that's one of the big things. Commitment to treatment, that's another one. Oftentimes, veterans with PTSD will go to treatment and they'll talk about football, baseball, cars, motorcycles, everything but what they're there for. Because nobody wants to talk about unpleasant memories, and that is the most unpleasant memory that they'll have to talk about. Stigma, shame. There's a lot of shame as far as that goes for PTSD. Loss of career or promotion opportunities is another reason why what makes it challenging. Screening tools, I did hand that out. PSSI is just another version of like a PCL. I believe they were both developed by, I think it was Dr. Edna Foe from University of Penn trauma program, if I'm not mistaken. They're almost identical in screenings, so you could use a PSSI or a PCL, either or, very similar. Again, assessment and diagnosis should be completed by a clinician. When you're doing that, it takes longer than a screening. Build proper rapport, that's all, like I talked about that. And again, it takes more, really it would take more than one session. Prevalence of PTSD, again, these numbers, it's hard to get accurate numbers, but they're kind of in line with what you mentioned there in your earlier slide, where the various studies I've seen for the Iraq and Enduring Freedom veterans, it's about 5 to 15%, almost unit specific, because again, like you screen units, and it's also when you do the screening that's hard to get accurate numbers. So for example, what they used to do is if they would screen for PTSD while individuals were still in country or getting ready to come back. Well, you're there with their entire unit then, who everybody's acting and behaving the same way. They're not going to screen positive on a PTSD screening there. So a lot of how you screen depends on when and where you do it, almost as much as the tool that you're using to get the numbers. So you're going to see a lot of variation. So that's something that's important, but we probably won't encounter that because most of these veterans, service members have been home for a while. But that's just something to be aware of. Really, screening for anyone for trauma, when and where you do it, is an important factor. So the majority of veterans do not have PTSD, but a lot higher population has readjustment issues, which have similar symptoms to PTSD. But I won't go into that because I don't think we... So this is one thing now that I do want to talk about, which, you know, I think is actually very important, what I see a lot of. So Dauphin County Vet Corps, we have 19 participants there. 4 participants out of the 19 were deployed. 2 have PTSD from deployment, 1 has MST. One of the big issues that I see that is very underreported in the justice-involved veterans is almost very few screenings or very few, anyone mentions personality disorders, specifically antisocial personality disorder. Out of those 19 participants, 8 have antisocial personality disorder, 4 have features of antisocial personality disorder. So again, that's something that is, everyone likes to talk about PTSD, but in the justice-involved veterans over the years, I'm seeing a lot of antisocial personality disorder, more so than post-traumatic stress disorder. And antisocial personality disorder, oftentimes the response I see from the justice side is usually antisocials are attracted to the drug lifestyle and the alcohol lifestyle, so they're going to come in with drug and alcohol charges over and over again. So the natural response is rehab, right? That's just what you do because that's a tool that you have. Well, I've had a veteran that has gone to 74 rehabs. You think 75 is going to change it? Or maybe it's a different diagnosis. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind that there's a lot more than just PTSD. PTSD seems to be the hot topic. That a lot, when you hear veteran, it goes hand in hand, but there's a lot of other issues. And antisocial is one that seems to, and at least with the justice-involved veterans, I encounter a lot more frequently, and they're almost never diagnosed. So, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but common issues, and again, I just talked about that with personality disorders, substance abuse, and PTSD. And that's probably the order of it. I mean, you see substance abuse, but usually the personality disorders usually misdiagnosed with substance abuse. That would be, the other topics, I know there's a lot I probably wanted to touch on, but I have to shorten it. So any other questions or anything for me?
Any questions? Julie was a great resource. When I was district attorney and we started our Veterans Court in Dauphin County, which was a no-brainer, starting a Veterans Court. I don't understand why any county doesn't start it, especially when you're running for election as DA that year. It's, having the resources of the VA, and now as a judge, I sit on our drug court, but I sub once in a while in Veterans Courts, and get to see the work that they do. We've often said, one of my assistant DAs when I was DA, that drug court was the first treatment court most counties started across the country. And we started our drug court, got it up and running, and then transitioned into a Veterans Court, mental health courts, guy named Steve Court, whatever it's going to be, all the specialty courts we seem to have now. But, drug court was the first one we had. My DA that did it said it was like her first love. The vet court was like the perfect match of a lifetime, because you're dealing with individuals who at one point did something substantial in their life, which we don't often have in some of the other treatment courts. And just the structure of the Veterans Court with the mentors that volunteer and play a huge, huge role in that. The success rate, the research shows, is higher in vet court than any other treatment court. But a lot of it's the work of DJOs, and in our county in particular, Jalou, the other counties he serves. So, any other questions? Hi.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
Back to you. All right, start back to Dr. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Jalou. That was really great. And as you could see, we have a lot of staff to learn in this landscape of the veterans, and over the next 12 months or so, working on this project will be really insightful, and we look forward to sharing that with the Commission at future policy meetings. So now we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about our the CASER application, the Commission on Sentencing and Record Exchange, our efforts to rebuild SGS Web to a more user-friendly, modern application, supporting essentially the 8th edition guidelines and the new guidelines as well. So before I turn it over to Christy, just in this space, as you know, we have been working with a firm called InfoMatrix, and that InfoMatrix group, for a number of reasons, the project kept getting delayed, especially staffing turnover, where I believe every person in every position who worked on that project shifted and changed at least once, if not more than once. So working with the chair and the vice chair, and then working also with the executive and administrative committee of the commission, it was determined that we should complete deliverables up to that time, pay them for those services, and part ways. So one of the action items later in the business meeting will be to ratify that separation. But I wanted to have Christy present on what the universe is like without the consulting firm, and how we envision moving forward. And because this is a pretty big sea change for her group, I asked Christy to think about over the next several months what a timeline for completion of this project will be like, but to present that in December. So this will be a broad brush stroke of sort of our plan and approach over the next several months to reset the project and rethink about what our approach will be and where we need targeted resources potentially for consultants. But the big shift is, rather than relying on an external entity to guide and lead this project, it's coming in-house. We're going to run and lead the project through Christie. So having probably said most of what she's going to say, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, the end. Any questions? So, yes, you did. This is my first slide, just to talk about, we are separating from InfoMatrix. So we had kicked off working with them last July in 2023. We were supposed to be done with this project already, and we are only probably about 40% of the way done by the time we finally ended the relationship with them. So as Matt mentioned, there were lots of reasons for that. They had a huge problem with staff turnover, so it was like we kept onboarding new people for them, and it seemed like we were starting over every month with a new person. There were some issues with their quality of work and project management. And then at the end of June this year, they said they could no longer commit to completing the contract within the original contracted budget, while the unplanned project extension kind of putting them into the red. So rather than negotiate anything with them, we decided to end the relationship, which was approved by the executive committee and will be discussed further at the business meeting. So as I mentioned, we're about 40% of the way done. You know, despite the challenges with working with InfoMatrix, we did make some significant progress on the application while we were working with them. I have some of the application features that we've completed or we're nearing completion on listed here. I'm not going to go through all of those. But I do want to say that much of the credit for what we have accomplished was definitely should go to my team, so Craig Briggs, John Michael, Matt Hanold, and Stephanie Kohler. They really did make the best out of kind of the less than ideal circumstances that we were encountering when working with InfoMatrix to keep the project on track. So the plan or the roadmap that Matt alluded to, I've got it phased out here. I'm not going to read every single bullet on the slide. But essentially with InfoMatrix out of the picture, we're rebooting the project. And so what we've been doing for the past month is we've been evaluating our options for staffing the project, which I will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. And then we've also been looking at how to better organize the work, which is what this next set of slides represents. And so the past month, as we transition away from InfoMatrix, we've been focused on continuing to make progress while figuring out the best path forward. So one of the first things listed here is that we've been auditing the current state. We've been taking some time to assess kind of what was working well for the project and what was working in the application that we've developed so far, and then what was not working, and, you know, was it what we wanted it to be. So we're trying to get a good picture of the current state of the project and the application. During this time, because we wanted to make sure we were still being productive, we've also been tackling a few of the significant technical challenges that it's been on our list to do for a while, but we just hadn't prioritized them, such as connecting the new application to the JNet portal and also developing the integration with AOPC to get their data into our system, as well as a few other technical maintenance items. So I'm calling the last month and this month as kind of our reset period for the project. And then we're going to move into a revamp period where, you know, I mentioned we were doing this evaluation of the current state, and we've identified basically a list of issues in the application that need to be addressed in order to deliver a really robust and effective application. So that's what we're going to move on to next, is just fixing these issues. So some of them are technical implementation issues where the developer didn't quite, you know, missed the mark on what we were doing. And then some of them are design issues where something we thought was good on paper just didn't, you know, quite work out the way we envisioned. So I think addressing these issues now before we moved into some of the future functionality will put us in a much better position when we start work on that next set of features. So once that cleanup work is done, we are going to get back to developing the major features of the application, and first up is completing the functionality to generate the sentencing guidelines in the new application. So we've already done a lot of work on offenders and judicial proceedings and offenses and prior record score functions. We still need to program the actual, like, generating the actual guideline recommendation, and then risk assessment, and then producing that sentencing guidelines report, or the GL form. And then after that, we'll move on to the screens that counties will actually use to submit sentence information to us. And then once we start development on that, we want to start user acceptance testing. So we want to get our user representatives, which is our education and outreach unit, into the application that we've built so far to start providing feedback to us to make sure we're not going off in the wrong direction. And then that user acceptance testing would continue for the rest of the project as we develop other new features. And then after that, the development team will move on to the resentencing guidelines module, essentially, and to also the revocation and resentence submission module. So I have all the features listed there, but I won't go through them. This is the point, too, like when we start that development, it's a good time for us to start talking to the counties that we want to pilot the application, start training them on the application and what we've developed so far, and come up with like a plan for actually onboarding them onto the new application. And then the last piece of development is kind of the more cleanup stuff. Any integrations that need to be developed that we haven't developed up to this point will be done. Any sort of data exports will be developed, and any sort of data management screens that we need to work on will be done kind of at the end there before the pilot. So that's our big roadmap for the rest of the project. So as far as the project team, and Matt alluded to this earlier, you know, we've had a lot of conversations about the best path forward as far as the staffing. Like, should we issue another RFP to find another vendor, or should we try to finish the project with in-house resources? And kind of given the expertise that we already have in-house, as well as what we've already accomplished, we did decide on the latter, so finishing the project is our in-house team, supplemented by individual contractors as needed. Rather than, you know, find another company like Infomatrix to manage and staff the project, we'll manage it and then just hire temporary staff to fill in specific gaps. So this is our current in-house team and who the people who have been working on the project thus far. The yellow boxes represent the kind of the 3 people that I think we need in order to supplement the staff and the skills that we have. So we would need a front-end developer, another full-stack developer, and then potentially another tester to help with the testing effort. The one in red, so the front-end developer, is probably the most critical at this point in the project, and so we've already been looking at some staffing options for that position. We have found someone, so we'll be discussing that at the business meeting a little later too, and looking for approval of a service contract for that position. All right, I feel like I'm racing through this. So project schedule, this is just kind of, I have on here like what our original schedule was, and then Infomatrix revised it to the middle line and pushed us into 2025, and then their last schedule had us rolling out to counties towards the end of 2025. So how does this all affect our project schedule? I don't know yet. Theoretically, it'll take longer since we're going to have a smaller team working on it, but given some of the issues that we were experiencing with working with Infomatrix, I don't know that it's going to be quite as impactful as we assume it would be. So the timeline also depends on how quickly we can find additional personnel to fill those positions that I mentioned and supplement our staff. So once we've had a little bit of time to get our feet under us and to adjust to the changes and reboot the project, we will have a better idea of like how long the work is taking the smaller team, we'll be able to put together a more realistic project plan. So I will share that with you guys all in December. And then lastly, I'll just say that I think we learned a lot from this initial effort with InfoMatrix, and we did accomplish a lot. Like, it's not like we've gotten nothing out of the effort. So I do think it was the right decision to end the partnership with them, and that our new approach will, give us the application that will support the commission objectives. And that's the other thing that I'll plan on doing in the December commission meeting, is actually doing a demo of what we've developed so far, so that you guys can actually see what we've done.
So I'll just add on a couple things really quick. First, this has been a challenging engagement for the commission and staff, and so just to echo what Christie said, but also to say that Christie's leadership has been phenomenal in this space, and leading us to a point where we could complete work with this consulting firm, but have a path forward with a clear vision of how we're going to do this. And that's a big testament to her team, Craig, Sean, Stephanie, and Matt as well. It was not an easy decision to split from this group because we had some momentum, but it was one step forward, two back, two forward, one back, however that was working. And clearly you could see from those timelines that there was a lot of uncertainty about how long this was going to take. And I think just one thing to stress, and we've mentioned this many times, the legacy application, the SGS Web, has been updated to support the 8th edition guidelines, and we are receiving feedback through the help desk and through Bobby's unit and the education and outreach specialist of when there are bugs or features that are working or working suboptimally. So we have functionality to support the new guidelines, to collect the data, to provide those information to judges prior to decisions. This will be, of course, a much better system when it's completed. So I think alarm bells would be ringing if we didn't have the legacy application of what are we doing at this point to support the new guidelines. So I'll also say, and this is a small benefit, is Christie just attended the National Association of Sentencing Commissions, and a number of states are trying to do similar initiatives of building these applications. So the idea of using an external vendor in-house, how to develop an RFP, we've learned a lot, as she mentioned, that are not just helping us for future engagements, but a lot of other sentencing commissions across the United States about what could have been done better or how to do this in a different way. And we're really lucky compared to other commissions that we do have a competent team of 5 tech folks in-house to support all the initiatives, not just this, but eventually parole guidelines and resentencing and the other phases that go along, not just with the 8th edition sentencing guidelines. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
So as far as ownership of that software, that at the end of the day, it belongs to the commission?
Absolutely, yes. And this is one of the, in any landscape, be it in courts, when you talk about case management systems, Christie certainly can say a lot more about this than me, is you have an off-the-shelf version of something that can be customized or modified, or are you building an original application? And there are no off-the-shelf sentencing applications, especially ones that fit all the different rules that go into sentencing for the different states. So the original SGS Web was a codification of, the 7th edition, 6th edition, 5th edition, and now the 8th edition update, but this will accommodate all the different rules, especially in what screens are developed based on this being checked or that being checked. So we're really leading the way, I think, in the nation, and hopefully once this is finally developed, it'll be a pretty amazing tool for folks in the Commonwealth. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So we're going to have one last piece, and then we'll take a break before the business meeting. And it's going to be, as I mentioned, this new initiative. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we're calling the data snapshots. As I mentioned, we have the opportunity to utilize our data and to educate our stakeholders on different issues. And we developed this first one around a particular case type that Brett Miller will go through in a few moments. But I'll just give an example. Like, we just recently completed the short sentence parole evaluation. So we have a report, but how do we disseminate the findings from evaluations or from things that we're learning? So we leverage this free software through Penn State to create these data stories or data snapshots. And with that, I'll turn it to Brett for a brief overview of our first snapshot that we hope to post on the web maybe next week on the Commission's website to showcase some of our data. And with that, I'll turn it to Brett.
So I just wanted to give just a quick update and overview of this new initiative that Matt just described. But as we've already talked about at this meeting, we have a lot of big assignments in the research and data unit. Like the Veterans Project a couple of years ago, the Firearms Project. And those take a lot of time to develop, and we end up with 100-plus page reports at the end of it. But we wanted to do something where we can maybe have a little bit more regular deliverables. So these are things that we can post on our websites, hopefully quarterly or approximately that often. And they can be sort of smaller mini analyses on just very specific dialed-in topics. So for this first snapshot, we wanted to look at just one single offense type and look at sentencing and any trends, conformity for that sentence type. And then in the future, as we go along and move through these, we can cover a variety of different topics, looking at different programs, different sentencing policies. So hopefully over time, covering this, a wide variety of topics. But I think I'll scroll through this first one just to give you guys an idea of what the concept is. So we've kind of taken some inspiration from some different reports and dashboards from other states. Maryland does a really nice sentencing snapshot. The Philly DA's office does some really nice visual reports. That's kind of what we're trying to model these after. So highly visual, but also a little bit of text narrative to sort of carry the thread of the story through it. And we picked PWID marijuana as our first offense here, just because it's sort of an offense that I think most people can understand, whether they're a practitioner or just the general public. People know what the offense is, and maybe even have some preconceived notions about what sentencing might look like for it. So just going through the story, we start off with in this case, a statutory definition. I don't think we need to spend too much time on that here, but the idea is manufacturing, delivery, or possession of a certain amount of a controlled substance. So to dig into this offense, we took a look at our sentencing data from the last 3 years, 2021 to 23, and we found that even though people know a lot about PWID offenses in general, and especially marijuana, these offenses are less than 1% of the overall caseload in Pennsylvania. So it's actually not that common of an offense. And we sort of took a dual purpose with this first report too, first talking about a specific offense, but also kind of talking through the sentencing guidelines and how they work for a given offense. So just scrolling through here, we come to our first graphic, and what we're looking at here is OGS. So in the text, there's kind of a description of, for a PWID offense, there's different levels of the offense that are mostly based on the amount of drug that's possessed. So in this case, we have 5 different OGS levels depending on the amount of marijuana that was possessed. But what's interesting is we kind of do a breakdown looking at how common each of those levels are. And what you see is about 2/3 of those are the lowest possible level. And then about 90% of all of these cases are the 2 lowest levels combined. So the majority of these are not necessarily low-level offenses, but the lowest possible categorical weights that are defined. Scrolling through, you see how we highlight different areas, showing that there's very few of the higher quantity offenses. And then we sort of move on to the next part of the sentencing guidelines, which is prior record score. And here, again, just small bits of text quickly highlight various aspects of the sentencing guidelines. And here we show that for this specific offense, nearly half of all cases had a PRS of 0, which is typical for all offenses. And then we find as you go up to higher amounts of drug quantities, you actually have even lower PRS categories. So close to 3/4 of the offenders had the PRS of 0 when you're looking at those higher drug quantities. Then you find that there's very low percentages overall of higher PRS categories, but it tends to be for those smaller drug quantities is where you do see the higher PRS values. We kind of take those two concepts, OGS, PRS, and then we put that together and go into the actual sentencing guidelines. There's a little more text here walking through how the guidelines work to create a recommended minimum sentence, the different definitions of the standard range, mitigated, aggravated ranges. And then we walk through a couple scenarios. So if we look at that lowest drug amount, we had an OGS 3, typically PRS 0. The recommendation was restorative sanctions up to 1 month of confinement. Then in comparison, we look at the highest possible quantity, OGS 10, PRS 0, and now the recommendation jumps up to 22 to 36 months of confinement. Just walking through a couple scenarios here. And then we look at the actual sentences imposed over these last 3 years and how they conform to our guidelines. So this graphic, we've used this graphic before. It shows where sentences fall within mitigated, standard, and aggravated ranges. What we see for marijuana-related PWIDs is that about 3/4 of these offenses are sentenced within the standard range. And when the sentence is outside the standard range, it tends to be lower in the mitigated range. We talk a little bit about sentencing alternatives. So about half of these cases, maybe more than half, receive no confinement sentence, probation. About another quarter receives county confinement, and very few of these marijuana PWIDs will receive a state incarceration sentence, less than 5% overall. There's another section here on sentence length. It's not showing up for me right now, but then sort of to wrap up this story, so we've walked through the 7th edition guidelines, how guidelines work, what the actual sentences were, and then we move on and just sort of take a look at the new 8th edition guidelines and have any changes been made from the 7th to the 8th. And what we really wanted to highlight was the fact that when we designed the 8th edition guidelines, we really wanted to take into account historical sentencing practices. What we found from that conformity slide a little bit farther up was that the majority of those sentences were actually below the standard range for the 7th edition. We tried to correct for that a little bit in the new 8th edition guidelines, and actually the recommended sentences are lower in the 8th edition guidelines across the board, across all drug quantity categories. So we just wanted to highlight that here at the end. So, for example, the lowest category, which is the most common, in the 7th edition, we could have recommended up to 1 month of confinement. Under the 8th edition, we're just recommending probation. And then even at the top end, which easily could have been a state sentence under the 7th edition, now we're recommending 9 to less than 12 months confinement, which would typically be a county sentence. So across the board, we've reduced these recommendations in the 8th edition. So that kind of wraps up this first data story. Like I said, this time we chose to focus in on one offense type and sort of also walk through how the guidelines work. But I think in future editions, we'll take a closer look at different topics like different DOC programs, evaluations policies, and different things of that nature. So, hopefully, like I said, as we go on here, we'll produce one of these, about quarterly, post it to our website, and can hopefully cover a wide variety of different topics. I think that's all I've got.
Great, thanks, Brett. So just a couple of things, just to reiterate what Brett said. I think the vision is to do this quarterly and to have them correspond with the commission meetings. We won't always showcase them at the meetings, but this was an interesting lesson for us too. I originally thought everything would have one or two sentences, but you think of who our audience is and who could come to this, it really provided us with an opportunity to explain the guidelines a little bit. So we had to define OGS, had to define prior record score, had to define conformity, had to define the standard range, and all kinds of concepts. So we thought a lot about who our audience is and what the purpose of this. And as you can see, really the purpose is to leverage the data that we have. And a lot of the text is explaining what goes on with the data. So you could imagine one of these maybe in December, maybe in March, depending on when we do this, that is about veterans involved in the criminal justice system. And since we don't know the proportion, even answering that X percentage are involved in the criminal justice system compared to non-veterans, and then what type of offenses are they committing? What type of sentences are they receiving? A similar targeted investigation, but leaning heavily on the data. So I think this gives us, as Brett said, like a really broad platform to look at evaluations, to look at impact analyses, projections, or dive really deep into an individual case type. And so again, we wrestled a little bit of who our audience is, and I think our audiences are, of course, gets to the community engagement stuff, the public, but it also is legislative members, it's our practitioners and stakeholders in the Commonwealth, it's the media, basically everyone could view this and learn something about sentencing or sentencing practices in the Commonwealth. So we tried heavily to, of course, remain completely neutral and just let the data speak for itself in what we were highlighting as you saw as we went. And as Brett said, so, 2/3 of the data is OGS 3. 90% is OGS 3 and 5. These people receive this. So that's our intent with this. And we would be certainly open to ideas that commission members have about what topics we should cover. I think that our research and data analysis subcommittee would be a great group when Brett meets with them midstream between commission meetings to vet that topic with them, to talk about it. So we're kind of wrestling now with the next one. I think the veteran one would be a really timely one. If we can match the data, probably not by December, maybe by March, and then thinking about showcasing as an example the work that's been done on the short sentence parole, maybe that evaluation and highlighting some of those findings. And if you remember, we did a multi-level type of analysis that looked at recidivism rates, misconducts, and then the cost and benefits associated with that type of program. So we could highlight the empirical findings in a very simplified, easy to digest type of approach, especially as we're asked to redo that evaluation by October next year with new data. But that was I think a really nice vehicle to display these type of results. So before we take a short break between the policy and the business meeting, any questions or thoughts on this data snapshot approach?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's very helpful. I think it's the kind of stuff to look at quickly, those of us that are in, practice and really get something out of. And as an aside, I had a case a couple weeks ago with the new guidelines dealing with a significant amount of cocaine, and I questioned Matt as to why the new guidelines were what they were, even though I voted on them. Thought I made a counter argument, but and he right away had data for me, in a similar type of way. He sent to me, I sent to the DA's office, and we were all educated in that regard. So I think these things, even if you don't have to get as in depth with the narrative portions of it, just the data snapshots from time to time that you guys are working on different stuff or have it. I think that's PWI marijuana is a great one to look at. You know, wonder what everybody's doing across the state with those, and I think it's very helpful, so.
Yeah, great. And I think the other thing that was nice about this is we could keep drilling down in granularity, but if someone were to ask a follow-up question, we could easily provide, like, an answer from the data unit about practices in their county or practices, something we haven't included in these. So they're gonna be broad on purpose, and then follow-up questions that we receive, we're able to answer individually or post some follow-up analysis if we wanted to.
All right, if there's no other questions, we will adjourn the policy meeting and take a break till
Yeah, that's fine.
7:10. All right, we'll come back 10 after.